Hi there, my name is Ashok Ferrey. I'm from Sri Lanka and I'm an author there. I'm the author of 4 books actually at the moment. A couple of collections of short stories called Pretty People and The Good Little Ceylonese Girl. One anthology called Love in the Tsunami, and my novel which is called Serendipity. My work tends to be humorous and quite cynical, sarcastic, I don't quite know what the word is, satirical, darkly satirical, and it's about life in Sri Lanka. I was born in Sri Lanka, but I grew up in Africa and in Europe, and then came back to Sri Lanka 20 years ago. So I kind of see it as an outsider looking in, and sometimes as an insider looking out. So it kind of works both ways, and the stories try and reflect that the psychology of the Sri Lankan person from underneath, from a slightly different point of view. It was written during the last months of a 28-year-old civil war in Sri Lanka. Having said that, I'm the sort of writer who skirts round the issue, so it doesn't confront the war straight on. It is ever present, but what I do is I have loads and loads of different characters, and I repeatedly come back to this metaphor of a kaleidoscope, because no one person or one community, I feel, can do justice to this very, very complex war. It's very easy for a reporter to fly in and after 2 hours file a report, and it's a very simplistic report that just has the goodies, the baddies. My view is that there were no goodies, there were no baddies, there were instead lots and lots of different points of view, and everybody had a story to tell, and no 2 stories were alike. So what I do in the book is I have 15 to 20 characters, all of whom do this kind of dance of death, for want of a better word, and each one of them sees the war differently. You have an absolute foreigner who's an ingenue who comes in. He's part of the love interest. His love interest is Pumi, who's half Sinhalese, half Tamil, and yet she's living in England. She only comes back to reclaim her share of the inheritance, which is a colonial villa in the Cinnamon Gardens area of Colombo. She wants to keep the family share. Everybody else, including her own mother, wants to sell and get the hell out. So she's kind of an oddball here. She says, why can't I stay? Why must I go? But of course, everyone in Sri Lanka is dying to sell up and go away. So you have this kind of ironies going on where nobody is what they seem, and nobody really says what you expect them to say. And I think essentially that gives you a sort of a handle on what Sri Lanka is. It's very complex. It's got 4 major world religions, innumerable castes, and then you have money overlaying all that. You have all these complex social structures and different races also. Lots and lots of small communities. Of course, you have the Sinhalese, the major community, you have the Tamils, but you have on top of that Parsis, Boras, Afghans, people from Burma, Thailand. You can tell in the names, the etymology is very interesting, but they've all been absorbed over the 3,000 years. So this one melting pot of Sri Lanka, Sri Lankans. Well, the 2 main characters in the book, there's Pumi, who is half Sinhalese, half Tamil. She lives in London. They left, her parents left during the first riots. There have been riots every 20 years or so, racial riots. And I remember when I was young, my parents took in several Tamil families. All the Sinhalese families down the road took in their friends and kept them and protected them. And it's one of these families then that subsequently emigrated to England. So Pumi grows up in England. She's English to all intents and purposes, although she has a Sri Lankan name. And it is something she realizes that no amount of living in England for 30, 40, 50 years, she will never be one of them. She's a barrister. She works in a very posh chambers, but she's kind of patronized by the other white barristers, men, because she's a woman, and in those days, and this is based on a real life character, in those days, to be a woman barrister in London who was not white, it was quite something. She had lots of stuff to fight against to get to where she did. So she comes to Sri Lanka and she realizes that although she's a stranger there, it is still home. And when her mother says, I could never go back to Sri Lanka, I could never be a second-class citizen in my own country, Pumi says rather wearily, far better to be a second-class citizen in somebody else's country. So, you know, she realizes that she will be a second-class citizen over there in England. So she wants to live back in Sri Lanka. She meets an English guy who comes out there to teach, actually he's Polish, a white guy who comes out there to teach in an international school, and he's the hero of the book. So they're the two protagonists, she and he, and they're always trying to get together and always not quite making it. So it's one of those sweet and sour love stories, and that's how the book starts. Well, I have now been living in Sri Lanka for 23, 24 years, and over that time, it's quite interesting as an author. You have friends who are like this. So I'm sad to say that most of these people are based on friends, but I do change them so that nobody gets crucified entirely. However, it's interesting to listen to different points of view. So somebody who you consider very close, you speak to them, and on this idea of war, everybody has a different idea, everybody has a different opinion. But it's not only that. I don't just deal with the war. There are issues of government, corruption, even little things like international schools, and the fact that the education system is in quite a bad shape. I was going to say, but I'll get into trouble if I do. So it's in quite a bad shape. So as a result, parents in Sri Lanka are forced to send their children to international schools, which are not really international at all. You know, so I make fun of everyone and anyone in this book, and I think I got a lot off my chest by writing it. So it was immensely satisfying for me to write it. As for the reader, I don't know about that, because I think too many people see themselves in it, in their different communities, different points of view, and everyone universally thinks, gosh, how could he say this? This is not me. Of course not. But it is. Trust me. I mean, that's how I see it. No, luckily, or else they know me better than to confront me with it. But I mean, you know, you are never safe with an author. You just don't say anything in front of an author. You'll never know where he might use it next. In my case, I try and be clever. So if it's a woman who I'm writing about, I'll frequently change it into a man. So the same voice or the same character comes out of a man's mouth as opposed to a woman's. Or you know, if it's a Sinhalese, I'll make them a Tamil. Or if it's a white man, I'll make him a Sri Lankan or whatever. So I mix them all about. But essentially, they're mouthpieces for what I see as the general malaise of the country, what I saw as the general malaise of the country. I would like to add here that when I wrote this in the last weeks of the war, it was a desperate time. There were so many people dying on both sides, and I felt it wasn't a war that could be won. Boy, I was wrong, and I'm glad I was proved wrong. However, the book was written in that moment, and it is of that moment when there was this mass hysteria on every side. You know, there were wild conspiracy theories. There were theories that the Americans had a boat waiting to airlift Prabhakaran off the coast of Trincomalee. There were all sorts of theories going on. And to this day, we will not know the absolute truth. And that is also quite sad. But from a novelist's point of view, all you do is you record what every man hears and what every man thinks. And that is what I've tried to do here. Well, surprisingly, you would think so, wouldn't you? But there were plenty of Sinhalese who were for Prabhakaran. There were plenty of traitors within inverted commas, and that comes across where I have a guy who belongs to yet another separatist party who allied. I mean, that party actually allied with the Tigers in the early years. Remember, you've got to remember that this book is actually set in the early 1980s. It's not set now, although it was written at the end of the war. It is set in the early years of the war. And there were, war makes strange bedfellows, and that's the point I was trying to make there. So there were Sinhalese who were pro-Tamil. Likewise, there were many Tamils who were pro-Sinhalese, who just wanted peace, and who did not want this kind of huge kind of separatist movement. But they were quiet about it. And in general, the majority of people in the country were quiet. Either way, they just wanted peace. They wanted their lives, they wanted to carry on. They were not so extremist that they wanted either to fight the war on the one side or the other. And I do try and represent that. So as you say, you would imagine that every single Tamil on the ground wanted this war. Wrong. And you would imagine that every Sinhalese on the ground wanted the war on the other side. Wrong again. You know, it was much more complex than that. And I don't think any writing up to now has done justice to that. Certainly not my book, because my book is just a collage, a kaleidoscope of fragments. But no proper book on the war has done justice to that either. I think we're all too close to it, really. My books up to then have been quite gently satirical about life in Colombo, life in Sri Lanka. I think what happened here at this particular time was that gentleness became more shrill. It became more hysterical, and I don't mean hysteria in terms of just sadness, but hysterical in terms of humor. The humor is shrill, the humor is extremely black, and extremely, the humor is violent. You know, things happen that shouldn't normally happen, and you may say it's an exaggeration. Now, the book begins, for instance, on the first page, you have this dotty old couple who retired. They're Sri Lankans who retired back home to Sri Lanka, having lived all their life in England, and are leading quite a small life, for want of a better word. And she goes out into the garden to cut her lady's fingers, what do you call it, okra, which is growing in her little home garden in the middle of Colombo, by the way, and she discovers a thumb in her garden. Now, a lot of people who read that have said, impossible, how crazy, how would you find a thumb in your garden? Well, trust me, it happened to me. I found a thumb in my garden, because where I live in Kolpeti, in the heart of central Colombo, there were 5 bombs over the 25 years that I've lived there. 5 different major bombs, and this particular bomb, there was a fine sheen of ball bearings on the front lawn because the Tigers had blown up 60 people at the other end of the road, and those bombs were full of ball bearings. And although I was 300 yards away, my lawn was covered with ball bearings, and we found a thumb on top of the parapet wall. So, so although those events sound surreal on the pages of a book, they are our life. That is actually what happened. Well, I shouldn't really spoil it, but I have to warn you that because it was written at that very bleak time in my personal life, when I felt that this was an idiotic war that couldn't be won by anyone, idiotic by the people in power, by everyone to prosecute this war. I'm sad to say that nobody comes off really well. I won't go much further than that, but it's quite bleak. Well, there is a kind of a redemption there, but that's all it is. It's not completely redemptive as in a Hollywood drama or Hollywood cinema where it's all la-di-da at the end. In my experience, life is not like that. Certainly not in Colombo. You know, nothing is what it seems. So there isn't that much redemption, but that is more my fault than the fault of the book. I mean, that is how I viewed life. If that book were written today, I think it would be much more redemptive, because actually peace has come. We are all much happier people now. There are no roadblocks, and life is actually pretty damn wonderful now. But it wasn't the case then when I wrote it. So things look very black in the pages of that book.